Russia's invasion of Ukraine sent tremors across the global economy.
It brought home to a lot of policymakers and business leaders that geostrategic risk is here to stay.
It left countries wondering how to power homes and industry.
We were very afraid that we won't be able to meet our energy demands.
And made feeding the world harder.
We were in an extended period of food price inflation, and the war really exacerbated a lot of that.
It highlighted gaps in essential sectors.
From full-fledged systems to ammunition, that capacity is actually not there right now.
It created new alliances and galvanized existing ones, while entrenching differences.
If we think about a multi-year war, it's going to be interesting to think about the sort of new economic ties that Russia builds to, certain key countries in Asia, in Latin America, and Africa.
We'll look at what 1 year of war in Ukraine has done to the global economy so far, and how a rude awakening to geopolitical risk is remaking trade relationships around the world. That's all coming up on Business Beyond. First things first, the human cost and the scale of suffering wrought by Russia's attack on Ukraine can't be framed in purely economic terms. But financial considerations did figure heavily in the response of the community of nations towards Russian aggression. Their balancing act was to advance sanctions on Russia while protecting their own economies from the consequences of punishing a key trading partner and a major food and energy supplier. Fast forward to the present, and Ukraine's Western allies say that's been working, to a degree anyway. The International Monetary Fund said global conditions are improving as inflation starts to slow, a far cry from initial fears that the war in Europe would plunge the world into a prolonged recession.
In 2022, the world got a little bit lucky. There was a comparatively mild winter, which meant that the energy demands weren't as high as they could have been. The world dodged a bullet to some extent in that some of the most negative effects that could have transpired didn't.
But the war is ongoing, and that the world economy isn't struggling as much as it could have doesn't say that much about the level of struggle still to come. While some of it can be addressed through policy making, not everything can. But let's look at what has been done. Following the invasion, the United States released 2 million barrels of oil from its strategic petroleum reserve. Europe's biggest Russian energy client, Germany, rushed to build out liquefied natural gas infrastructure in a bid to wean itself off of the now problematic supply, albeit slowly. For a few weeks now, seaborne crude oil imports from Russia to the EU have been prohibited. For Western shippers still trading Russian oil, the EU and the G7 have now instituted a price cap. Some analyses point to these sanctions and measures and say they've acted as a drag on Russia's tax revenues from oil and gas, even as Europe continued to import Russian energy in the months following the invasion. But Russian aggression also established the need to find additional energy sources, and is therefore helping to ramp up renewables use around the world.
The fear of not being able to meet our energy demands has really implied an enormous effort both to diversify, so find providers elsewhere, and speed up the energy transition. Now, the first is not necessarily part of the green transition because we're still consuming fuels that are not renewable. But the second is, and you really see that the investments and that are made in the European Union, but also worldwide, are really being accelerated.
The war also forced compromises in European efforts to achieve key climate goals, like Germany's rush to forge ahead with new LNG import infrastructure, and the EU deciding to recognize natural gas as a form of green energy, even if it's technically a fossil fuel.
Would Europe have put, natural gas in the green taxonomy in the absence of this war? So I think there are all these things that we don't know about in terms of the government policy response, particularly when it comes to natural gas. I think that there had been a lot of debate in the West when we thought about our climate goals, whether natural gas played a role in the transition. And I think this is now settled.
But not everything is. Remember when we said earlier that not everything is within policymakers' control? If a mild winter in 2022 helped keep energy demand in check and reserves full, more severe weather up ahead could revive concerns over energy supply insecurity, also depending on where that severe weather is.
I think it's going to be very challenging. I mean, with China reopening in particular, I mean, one of the things that Europe benefited from was also you had warmer winters in Asia. And so there were volumes that were not needed in Asia. If we do see, for example, more Chinese demand for gas, what does that do in terms of the supply into Europe? And if you do get a colder winter, I think it's going to be, much more challenging. And all the conversations that we were having about potential deindustrialization of Europe because of an energy crisis, those type of concerns may materialize again if these factors come to play.
Some say those supply concerns could even herald the comeback of Russian hydrocarbons to Europe. Speaking at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Forum, Qatar's Minister of State for Energy Affairs expressed difficulty imagining a world without it.
I don't think some of the countries that were depending 100% or a very large percentage on Russia will not go back to 100% or 80% or maybe 50%. They will diversify and they'll learn from that situation and probably have a much bigger diversity. But the Russian gas is going to come back, in my view, to Europe. Is it next year? Is it in 5 years? I don't know.
A colder winter, an increase in energy demand around the world could threaten to take the discussion back to where it was a year ago when the war started. And the longer the conflict persists, the more people's willingness to live with high energy costs will be tried.
To me, this is, a question about how do you manage the energy trilemma, which is sustainability, affordability, and access. And I don't think we've really had a test yet. Like if we do face significant energy shortages next year, I think you can see European consumers saying, well, the most important thing for me is access and price. And so I think that's always going to be the challenge for governments is how can you deliver reliable, affordable energy at the price that consumers are willing to pay?
The war's impact on the affordability of energy has fed into another, already complicated access issue: the cost of food. Already high food prices climbed even higher as Ukrainian grain sat stuck in ports, sparking fears of a food shortage. Early hopes that India would step in and fill the export gap with its own wheat failed to materialize. That's after a record-breaking heat wave made for a smaller crop than expected, and the Indian government instituted an export ban, triggering even more price spikes. But a measure of relief came when the so-called Black Sea Grain Initiative, brokered by Turkey between Russia and Ukraine, helped restart the stalled Ukrainian exports. But that has had a limited effect on food costs worldwide.
We're in wheat particularly tight period, and we sort of measure that as your ending stocks divided by your total use. So particularly among major exporters. So that's at the tightest period it's been since 2008, I believe. And so you have this as the backdrop. That's why prices are elevated. So if you have a weather problem on top of that, you'll see, anywhere from 20 to 40% increases in price.
The Food and Agriculture Organization's Cereal Price Index shows a decline from post-invasion heights. But there's even more reason to assume these levels will not hold.
The other big impact of the war that hasn't even been fully realized is the impact on fertilizers. So you both had a lack of exports from Russia and Belarus, as well as the impact on natural gas supplies to Europe, causing a big spike in cost of producing fertilizers. So there were those stories that nearly 70% of fertilizer production in Europe at one point was shut down. But the main point is that you had this huge spike in fertilizer prices globally, and that's going to impact fertilizer usage for this season.
As with energy, the war has led to alternative trade corridors and supply diversifying measures in agriculture. And as with energy, Russia's status as a supplier for fertilizer and agricultural products has become a liability in the face of a changed geopolitical landscape.
Brazil, for example, wants to institute a policy of being much more self-sufficient in fertilizer production. They were exposed and very concerned about their ability to import from Russia. Another example of a change in policy was China importing corn from Brazil. They hadn't ever previously imported corn from Brazil. They had imported from the Ukraine and the US. And when the Ukraine was cut off from them, they panicked, and they've become a structural, very large importer of corn.
But amid all the shifting of grain supply, it's important to remember the global food system was already broken before the war.
Impact of the war in Ukraine is an additional layer to existing long-standing failures in the global food system. The rise in food prices has hit several poorer countries harder than the global average. For example, in Ethiopia, food prices have increased by 44%, and our colleagues in Syria are telling us that food prices have increased by 92% over the last year in the country.
Before Ukraine was invaded, almost a tenth of the global population did not have enough food to eat. A hunger situation in places like the Horn of Africa, already made dire by climate change, has been compounded by a war that's made food more expensive on global markets. Having looked at how food and energy resources were changed by the war, there's one resource whose use is necessitated by the war: military equipment. Per one estimate, Ukraine is firing more than 5,000 artillery rounds every day, and the war has highlighted vulnerabilities in the capabilities of the weapons-producing nations of the West.
The ability for the United States as well as European allies to really ramp up production of defense materials, from full-fledged systems to ammunition, that capacity is actually not there right now. And what we're seeing is considerable strain in the U.S. defense industrial base in terms of being able to really produce the kinds of systems and materials that the U.S. military would need in a conflict of its own, for example.
The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has highlighted this point as well, giving the example of 8,500 Javelin anti-tank missiles the US has sent Ukraine. That's equivalent to at least 4 years of production. And ramping that up takes time, with supply issues, especially in raw materials, slowing down the process. Suffice to say, the Russian invasion has made especially the US and Europe think about not just their ability to support a war effort like Ukraine's, but their capacity to adjust to a situation where they themselves might be embroiled in a conflict elsewhere.
I think what that would mean then, of course, is that the United States would redirect its production of defense goods for the war that the United States would ultimately be fighting. So that would have significant implications for Ukraine's ability to defend itself, particularly given the state of Europe's defense industrial base, which is probably in an even more precarious position than that of the United States.
Beyond the West, however, the war is being closely watched by clients of Russia's defense industry, who are deriving conclusions of their own.
If you think about a country like India, for example, which has been a very key defense partner with Russia, I think Indian defense planners are probably very concerned about what their military kit is actually capable of. There's a lot of countries around the world that were buying Russian military equipment. I think they'll be looking to other sources because so far the performance of the Russian military and its military equipment has not been particularly impressive.
Let's take stock. In determining how the war changed the global economy, we looked at energy, food, and defense, and we found a few commonalities. But perhaps the most striking of all is that it forced a rethink of previous arrangements through the lens of geostrategic risk.
If before you could generally go where economics said is the most profitable place to be and let the politics be the politics, now firms have seen just how quickly traditional trade flows can be disrupted by geostrategic risks. And suddenly they are thinking about what are governments going to do to protect and ensure themselves against future tensions with their rivals. And all of that is coming together to make investment more cautious, more local, less willing to roll the dice on a far-flung and perhaps fragile supply chain. And all of that has implications, of course, for real people and real jobs.
That said, the established chains of global commerce can't and won't be easily undone. And this newly urgent sense of caution is more likely to apply to some sectors more than others.
You probably won't necessarily see mass movements of existing production, but you might see diversion of where new factories were going to get built or expansions are going to go. Just because the cost involved in moving some of this stuff is staggeringly high. It depends on the types of production you're looking at. So already several industries have been identified as particularly strategically important. So semiconductors. It is very clear that the US and the EU are going to throw considerable resources and regulatory muscle behind trying to make sure that they have localized strength in semiconductor manufacturing.
The lesson that closer trade and economic relations might not ultimately lead to more peace, and that those ties can in fact be weaponized, was a hard one to learn. But the war might ensure it's one that sticks.
There used to be an aphorism in international trade that no two countries in the world with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other. This was like one of these cliches in international relations. Well, I've eaten at the McDonald's in Kiev and I've eaten at the one in Moscow. So we could park that one now.
A world at war is a world divided into camps, and fragmentation brings with it difficulties in terms of solving global problems. Especially if there's a disappearing baseline for what counts as acceptable behavior between sovereign nations, and disagreement as to how transgressions should be addressed.
The number of countries that is actually not necessarily against Russia when it comes to the war issue is actually quite big. In population terms, it is only 35% of world population that is actually sanctioning Russia. The rest is either neutral or is even with Russia. Now, this is important as far as the effectiveness of sanctions is concerned, because the potential for sanctions leakage, namely trying to help Russia to bypass the sanction, is actually quite big.
But if the war in Ukraine has put paid to the notion that mutual economic dependency unites countries and forces them to abide by the same set of rules, which guiding idea would then take its place? The longer the war goes on, the bigger this question becomes.
First, the war needs to come to an end. Everybody will see the benefits of that war coming to the end, and then maybe we can take it from there. Small wins, small gains, small successes is what I would go for. Try and solve small problems one at a time, and solve them with as many countries around the table as possible.
And that's it for this edition of Business Beyond. If you want to see more of what we do check out our recent video on whether China will ever become the world's largest economy. Thank you for watching, and see you later.